What happens when two cultural titans from completely different worlds meet backstage and forge an unexpected bond of respect? In 1969, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, and Barbra Streisand, Broadway's brightest star, shared a moment that few knew about, one of mutual admiration that transcended music, fame, and the pressures of their personal lives. Imagine the scene: two legends, one known for shaping the sounds of a generation, the other revered for her voice that could stop a room in its tracks. Elvis Presley, fresh off a 7-year hiatus from live performances, was returning to the stage at a time when his image was being questioned, his relevance overshadowed by the rise of new musical forces like the Beatles. His stage presence had once been untouchable, but now, it seemed, his time in the sun might be fading. On the other hand, Barbra Streisand was at the height of her own meteoric rise. Already an icon of Broadway, she was striving to expand her horizons and prove she was more than just a diva. Her flawless voice and commanding performances were renowned, but the industry's relentless pressure to conform to the ideal of the perfect woman weighed heavily on her. Every performance, every note, was a battle, not just for acceptance, but for respect in a world that reduced her to a label. The moment these two figures, so opposite, yet so alike in their vulnerabilities, crossed paths backstage in Las Vegas, the energy was electric, palpable. They weren't just two stars meeting each other, they were two souls who had fought their own battles against the public eye, against impossible expectations, and ultimately, against themselves. In this fleeting interaction, both were reminded that beyond the glittering exterior of fame, the struggles of their hearts were more alike than they could have imagined. And then, something unexpected happened. What began as a moment filled with tension, unease, and even a bit of awkwardness, soon became a revelation. In a world where every word and gesture is scrutinized, they found something rare: mutual respect. What would unfold next between these two giants of their time was more than just a chance encounter. It was a lesson about the deep, often hidden human need for understanding, connection, and vulnerability. Stay with me as we journey back to that moment when two legends found solace in each other's presence, an encounter that would define their relationship and leave an indelible mark on both their lives. To understand the significance of the moment when Elvis Presley and Barbra Streisand met backstage, we need to look at the emotional landscapes they were navigating at the time. Both were at pivotal moments in their careers, each facing pressures and challenges that their audiences couldn't possibly fathom. Elvis Presley had once been the king of rock and roll, a title he had worn proudly as he changed the face of music forever. His voice, his swagger, his ability to electrify an audience, he was the personification of stardom. But by 1969, the king was faltering. The public's adoration had started to wane, and his place as the dominant musical figure of the era was being challenged by newer, more rebellious acts like the Beatles. Elvis, once an unstoppable force, found himself questioning his relevance. After a 7-year hiatus from live performances, Elvis returned to Las Vegas in 1969, but it wasn't the triumphant return he had hoped for. The glitz and glamour of Las Vegas were now in full swing, but so was the changing musical landscape. Elvis's movies, once beloved by fans, had become outdated, and his music was no longer leading the charge in rock and roll. His comeback was seen as a desperate attempt to reclaim his throne, but there was no certainty. Elvis was a man torn between the nostalgia of his golden years and the fear that he might never recapture his throne as the king of rock and roll. The press, fans, and even his own doubts plagued him. His comeback shows weren't as grand as he had hoped. His once unquestioned dominance now felt fragile, and the weight of that vulnerability was heavy. But behind the charismatic performance on stage, behind the sequins and the spotlights, Elvis was grappling with insecurity. He had not only lost his place at the top, he was fighting to prove he could still do it. Could he still be the king? Across the entertainment spectrum, Barbra Streisand was battling her own demons. Having achieved tremendous success on Broadway, she had become synonymous with perfection. She was admired for her incredible vocal range, her mastery of performance, and her ability to command any stage. Yet, as much as the world adored her, they didn't always know how to place her. She was often categorized, even criticized, for being difficult or too much. The very traits that made her unique were the ones that made the industry, and even her own fans, uncomfortable. Streisand had spent years striving to carve out a career beyond Broadway. She wanted to prove to the world, and perhaps to herself, that she was more than just the voice of a diva. Her transition from Broadway to film had been met with its own set of struggles. She was fighting against a glass ceiling in Hollywood, a place that had a narrow view of what a woman could do. Despite her tremendous talent, she was constantly reminded that being too talented or too confident in a woman could lead to judgment. Barbra, standing in the shadow of the perfect woman persona the industry had cast upon her, yearned for something more: respect, recognition, and equality in a world that often reduced her to just another diva. She was used to the pressure to be flawless, but she longed to be understood for more than just her impeccable vocal technique. She wanted to be acknowledged as an artist with real depth, complexity, and humanity. Now, picture the scene in 1969. Elvis Presley was preparing for a live show at the International Hotel in Las Vegas. It was one of his first major performances since his comeback. The pressure to prove himself was palpable. And then, backstage, Barbra Streisand, who was in town for her own performances, was introduced to him. At first glance, they must have seemed like opposites. Elvis, the rock and roll legend, and Barbra, the Broadway sensation. Elvis was the embodiment of rebellion and sexuality, while Barbra was known for her voice, her control, and her perfectionism. Yet, in that moment, their worlds collided, not in a clash, but in an unexpected meeting of mutual understanding. There they were, two icons from different worlds, both struggling with their own personal and professional demons. Elvis, trying to recover his identity and relevance in a changing world, and Barbra, struggling to be seen as more than a stereotype, hoping to break free from the industry's impossible expectations. Neither one of them knew it yet, but they were about to experience a moment of connection that would shatter the barriers they had been facing in their own careers. When they came face to face, there was no immediate exchange of words, only the silent recognition of two souls who had felt the weight of fame's heavy hand. They were not just entertainers to each other, they were equals, carrying the same burdens, experiencing similar struggles in their respective worlds. Their meeting wasn't just a celebrity encounter, it was the kind of moment that doesn't often get captured on camera. It wasn't the fanfare of a red carpet, the glint of camera flashes, or the applause of an adoring crowd. It was raw, human, and quietly profound. This was no mere handshake between two stars. It was a silent recognition of the weight they both carried. They would soon learn that despite their different paths, their struggles were deeply intertwined. Their meeting, still under the radar, would become one of the most meaningful connections of their lives. As the backstage encounter between Elvis Presley and Barbra Streisand unfolded, it was clear that the weight of their respective struggles had already begun to shape the emotional landscape of their interaction. But while there was an undeniable tension in the air, neither of them were fully prepared for the complexity of emotions that would come to define this meeting. It was one thing to admire someone from afar, but quite another to meet them in person and see their vulnerability up close. Elvis, ever the perfectionist in his own right, was acutely aware of the expectations surrounding him. His 7-year absence from live performance had been filled with self-doubt. He had become a figure from the past, a relic of an earlier era when rock and roll was king, and the world was still marveling at his unique ability to command a stage. But now, he felt overshadowed by newer talents and rising musical forces. As he prepared to meet Barbra, Elvis couldn't help but wonder how she would perceive him. He had heard about her immense vocal talent and seen her rise to fame in ways that no one could have predicted. But what if she saw him as just another fading star, someone who had been left behind by the changing tides of music? Would she look at him as the man who had once ruled the world but was now a shadow of his former self? The fear of rejection burned within him. Elvis had faced the scrutiny of the press, the fans, and even the public at large, but it was the thought of being dismissed by another artist, someone as talented and revered as Barbra, that shook him to his core. He didn't know it yet, but in this meeting, he wasn't just fighting for his career's future. He was fighting for his sense of worth. Barbra, on the other hand, was also keenly aware of the weight of their first encounter. She had already established herself as one of the most powerful voices of her generation, but despite her success, there was a fear that she was still being treated as a novelty act or a showgirl type. She had the talent, the vision, and the drive, but often, the world was reluctant to see her for anything more than her stunning vocal abilities. As she walked into the backstage area to meet Elvis, she knew that this moment would likely be scrutinized, not just by the press, but also by herself. Would Elvis see her for what she truly was? Would he respect her as a fellow artist? Or would he, like so many others, only see her as a product of the Broadway machine? The pressure to prove herself as more than just a diva was immense. Barbra was used to being underestimated. She had fought for years to earn her place at the top, not just as a singer, but as a woman in a world dominated by male power players. But meeting Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, brought its own kind of tension. Would their worlds collide, or would they find a common bond that transcended their differences? When they finally met, the atmosphere was filled with a delicate nervousness. There was a clear sense of both curiosity and wariness between them, each of them wondering what the other thought. Elvis was the first to break the silence. He gave Barbra a smile, though it was tinged with a hint of uncertainty. "You know," Elvis said, "I, Setfar's always admired your voice. You spur something special." Barbra, taken aback by the sincerity in his words, responded with equal candor. "Thank you, but I've got to say, it's an honor to meet the king himself. You changed the game, Elvis." The exchange was simple enough, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Here were two people, each struggling to maintain their place in a rapidly changing world, taking a moment to recognize the greatness in the other. The air seemed to shift as the conversation unfolded. Barbra spoke about her own battles in the entertainment world, the way the media had framed her, the expectations that had been placed on her. Elvis, in turn, shared his fears of fading into obscurity, of never being able to recapture the magic of his earlier years. Their words, at first guarded, soon became more open, revealing the deeper truths behind their public personas. It was a raw moment. Two cultural titans, each vulnerable in their own right, speaking openly about the fears that had haunted them for years. They weren't just talking about their careers, they were talking about their very selves, their struggles, and the constant pressure to be perfect, to meet impossible standards. As they continued to talk, the emotional weight of their conversation became even more pronounced. Barbra, often seen as the perfect woman in the public eye, was expressing her frustrations with the industry's expectations, while Elvis, the man who had once embodied freedom and rebellion, confessed his fears of being forgotten. In that moment, they were no longer a famous woman and a fading rock star. They were simply two artists, two human beings, sharing a moment of connection that transcended the spotlight. The tension between them was slowly giving way to understanding, as they began to see each other not just as figures in the entertainment world, but as individuals who had battled the same inner demons. Their struggles were no longer separate, they were shared, and in that recognition, the stage was set for something far greater than either could have anticipated. As the conversation between Elvis Presley and Barbra Streisand deepened, what had started as a polite exchange soon transformed into a moment that neither would forget. The walls between them, built by years of fame, expectations, and public personas, began to crumble, revealing the shared vulnerabilities they both carried. In this fleeting encounter, their mutual respect and understanding grew, and with it, something powerful began to emerge, a connection that went far beyond their individual struggles. The turning point in their conversation came when they both acknowledged the depth of their respective battles in the industry. Elvis, who had always been known for his bravado, was suddenly open, almost raw. His usual swagger was replaced with a quiet vulnerability as he looked at Barbra and said, "You know, sometimes I wonder if I'll ever get back to where I was. I know what I'm capable of, but sometimes it just doesn't feel like enough." Barbra, who had often been the subject of harsh criticism for her perfectionism, could relate in a way that few others could. She saw the pain in Elvis's eyes, the fear of being left behind, and it mirrored her own struggles. She had spent years striving for perfection, only to be labeled as difficult, demanding, and at times ungrateful. But in Elvis, she saw a man who, like her, was constantly fighting for respect, not just from the world, but from himself. She responded with a knowing smile, one that held more than just admiration. "I get it. You here not alone in that. We here all trying to prove something to ourselves, aren't we?" The moment hung in the air. There, in that backstage room, two of the most famous figures in entertainment were not talking about their achievements or their legacies. They were talking about their insecurities, their fears, and the pressure to be more than they could ever be. It was in this simple exchange that the true depth of their connection was revealed. They were no longer the king of rock and roll and the Broadway diva. They were two people who had been scarred by the relentless pursuit of perfection, fame, and recognition. Their struggles, so different on the surface, were strikingly similar. In that raw vulnerability, they found not just respect, but a shared understanding that would last long after the meeting ended. As their conversation progressed, the atmosphere shifted from one of mutual empathy to one of profound respect. Elvis, who had always been known for his public persona, began to express his admiration for Barbra in a way that few had ever seen. "You've got something special, Barbra. You don't just sing. Your voice carries something that makes people feel alive. It's rare," Elvis said, his voice soft but filled with sincerity. Barbra, who had heard praise for her voice countless times, was moved by the authenticity in Elvis's words. But what struck her most was the fact that Elvis, the king himself, was recognizing her not just as a peer, but as a fellow artist. He wasn't just admiring her talent, he was acknowledging the emotional depth that she poured into every performance, the very essence of who she was as an artist. Her eyes softened as she responded, "Thank you, Elvis. That means more to me than you know. You were the one who taught us all that music isn't set just about the notes. It's set about what seps underneath, and you, Sep, always had that." In that moment, the barriers between them dissolved completely. The public personas that they had each spent years building, the king and the Broadway queen, faded into the background. What remained was a mutual respect between two people who had given their hearts and souls to their craft, battling against the weight of fame, the pressure to constantly evolve, and the fear that they would never be enough. There was no grandstanding, no show of bravado, just a quiet recognition of each other's humanity. This was the moment that solidified their bond, the turning point where they went from mere acquaintances to two artists who understood each other on a deeper level. Elvis and Barbra were no longer two stars from different worlds. They were kindred spirits, linked by their shared struggles, their shared humanity. As their conversation reached its climax, there was an emotional shift. The room, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now buzzed with a newfound sense of camaraderie. Barbra, usually so guarded, let down her defenses. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not as the diva or the showgirl, but as an artist who had fought just as hard as anyone for her place in the world. Elvis, too, was different. The man who had been unsure of his place in the entertainment industry, uncertain of whether he could ever reclaim his former glory, now felt a sense of reassurance. He had found not just a peer, but someone who understood the pressure to constantly prove oneself. In Barbra's presence, he found a sense of peace, an understanding that transcended the accolades and the fame. They were simply two people, two artists, sharing a moment of raw, unfiltered connection. This moment wasn't just a conversation. It was a revelation. Both Elvis and Barbra had spent years battling the expectations of the world, constantly striving for more, only to find that what they truly needed was not more recognition, but someone who truly understood them. In each other, they found that understanding. The moment they shared was one of emotional release, a fleeting but profound connection that would resonate with both of them for the rest of their lives. The tension had finally broken, and in its place stood a powerful, quiet bond, one that spoke louder than any performance, any applause, or any award. Elvis and Barbra had found mutual respect, not through words or accolades, but through shared vulnerability and the raw honesty of their exchange. The backstage meeting between Elvis Presley and Barbra Streisand was a fleeting moment, a brief exchange in the whirlwind of their respective careers, but its impact would echo far beyond that one conversation. It was a defining encounter, one that would shape both of their futures in subtle yet significant ways. What they shared backstage was more than just mutual respect. It was an acknowledgement of each other's humanity, the struggles beneath the fame, and the unspoken bond that transcended the musical worlds they inhabited. In the days that followed, both Elvis and Barbra would reflect on that moment in Las Vegas. It was clear that the encounter had affected them both deeply. For Elvis, the compliment from Barbra, a woman he held in such high regard, was not just a passing remark, it was a validation of his struggle to remain relevant. Elvis had always thrived on the adoration of his fans, but in that quiet moment with Barbra, he was reminded that his true worth lay not in the spotlight, but in the art he created, the authenticity of his performances, and the impact he had on those who truly understood him. Barbra, too, would later speak fondly of their time together. In interviews, she often mentioned the respect she felt for Elvis, not just as a musician, but as a man who had navigated the relentless pressures of fame. For someone who had spent years fighting to be seen as more than just a diva, the recognition from Elvis was a pivotal moment. It was a reminder that despite their differences in style and background, they were both fighting similar battles. They were both artists who had given everything to their craft and had, at times, felt lost in the process. This encounter was more than just a passing moment, it was the validation they both needed. For Elvis, it was a reaffirmation of his worth beyond the image of the king of rock and roll. For Barbra, it was a moment that reminded her that she too was seen, not just for her voice, but for her struggles, her perseverance, and her authenticity. Their connection was not fleeting. It had a lasting impact on both of them, and it became a cornerstone of their mutual respect. The meeting between Elvis and Barbra was more than just a personal encounter. It was a moment that transcended their individual worlds and spoke to the larger cultural landscape. In an era defined by the clash of musical genres and the rise of new stars, the backstage meeting between these two giants signaled something important, a breakdown of the barriers between different forms of entertainment and an acknowledgement that true respect could exist beyond genre, ego, and fame. At the time, the entertainment industry was still deeply divided. Elvis represented the classic rock and roll ethos, the wild, rebellious energy that had defined an era. Barbra, on the other hand, was the epitome of Broadway glamour, a performer whose style and sensibilities were worlds apart from Elvis's. Yet, in that backstage room, they had found common ground built on shared struggles and mutual respect. Their meeting shattered the illusion that artists from different genres, different worlds, couldn't understand and admire each other. The connection between Elvis and Barbra was a quiet revolution, one that demonstrated that the power of music, of art, was universal. It didn't matter if you were a rock star or a Broadway legend, what mattered was the authenticity of the struggle, the vulnerability behind the persona, and the respect that came from one artist recognizing another's fight. This meeting, although brief, became a cultural touchstone, a reminder that the power of connection and understanding could exist even in the most unlikely of places. It was a testament to the idea that the greatest artists, no matter their genre, often shared more in common than they realized. They were, after all human, all fighting for their place in a world that demanded the impossible. In the years that followed, neither Elvis nor Barbra spoke extensively about the meeting, but the impact was undeniable. Elvis would go on to continue his Las Vegas residency, reaffirming his place in the entertainment industry, while Barbra would solidify her status as one of the greatest performers of her generation, transcending Broadway and film to become a global icon. What remained, however, was the bond they had shared. In interviews, Elvis would sometimes mention Streisand with a sense of reverence. He spoke about her voice, her artistry, and the respect he had for her as an artist who had carved out her own path in the world. Barbra, in turn, would reflect on how that moment with Elvis had reminded her of the importance of being true to oneself, of not letting the pressures of the industry diminish the artist within. The world may not have fully understood the significance of their backstage meeting, but for Elvis and Barbra, it was a turning point, an encounter that helped them redefine their place in the world and reminded them that at their core, they were not just performers, but people who understood the weight of the spotlight. The aftermath of this encounter wasn't marked by grand gestures or collaborations. It was marked by an enduring sense of mutual respect. Their bond may have been a quiet one, but it was deep, built on the understanding that fame doesn't define a person. What truly matters is the artist behind the name, the struggles they face, and the respect they earn from those who truly understand their journey. This meeting, though brief, changed both of their lives. It became a moment that would live on in their hearts, a reminder that even in the most unlikely of friendships, there is power, there is understanding, and there is the possibility for something greater than fame itself. In the end, the backstage meeting between Elvis Presley and Barbra Streisand was more than just an unexpected encounter between two of the most famous people of the 20th century. It was a powerful reminder that even those at the top of their respective fields, those we perceive as invincible, are at their core vulnerable human beings. Despite the fame, the accolades, and the adoration, both Elvis and Barbra were fighting their own battles. They were battling for respect, for recognition, and for the space to be seen as real, authentic people beyond their public personas. In a world that often places celebrities on pedestals, we tend to forget that they, too, carry the weight of expectations. They are held to impossible standards, forced to navigate the complexities of fame, and often left to grapple with the very human fears of rejection, failure, and obscurity. And yet, in that moment backstage, Elvis and Barbra found a rare connection, one that transcended their fame, their careers, and their public images. It was a moment of raw vulnerability, mutual understanding, and shared respect, one that left a lasting impact on both of them. This story serves as a reminder that no matter how high we rise, we all share the same basic human needs: understanding, validation, and connection. The struggles of Elvis and Barbra, despite their differences, were strikingly similar. They had both given their hearts to their craft, endured the pressure to meet impossible expectations, and fought to be seen as more than just their images. And in each other, they found not just admiration, but a sense of solidarity. Their encounter, though brief, proved that mutual respect doesn't come from accolades or titles. It comes from seeing the humanity in each other. It's about understanding the challenges, the insecurities, and the triumphs that come with being an artist in the public eye. It's about recognizing that behind every face we see in the spotlight, there's a person who is just as vulnerable, just as human as anyone else. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about the backstage meeting between Elvis and Barbra? Can you think of any other moments where unlikely figures shared a mutual respect or bond despite their differences? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspectives. And as always, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep the conversation going. This was more than just a story about two stars. It's a reflection of what it means to be human and how the greatest connections often happen when we least expect them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.